Good morning, everyone. It's Mr. Boff here. I'm going to focus on the poem London Today on its own for no other reason than it's my favourite poem in the anthology, and it's a magnificent poem. It gives me the opportunity to show you this coloured image, the original illustrated version of the poem, and really just to demonstrate how reading poetry is not about solving a puzzle or working out a riddle, but it's all about reading with a particular kind of focus and attention that's perhaps different than the focus and attention we give language in other realms of our lives. So it's a different style of reading. It's not, as I'm at pains to labour the point, it's not solving a puzzle. I've not got some secret answer to this poem about what this poem's about, okay? Now, I've read this poem many times, hundreds of times, and if we consider that great works of art are works of art that have never finished saying what they have to say, then this is a poem that endlessly says new things to me and is endlessly rewarding as a result of that. Okay, so just a couple of quick things about this poem. So it's published in 1794 by William Blake. Blake is a painter, he's a writer, he's an illustrator, he's an engraver, he's an artist in the broadest, fullest sense of the term. And this is from a collection of poems called Songs of Innocence and Experience. This is from the Experience section, and really this is about if innocence is a sort of celebration of childhood innocence in that sort of Jean-Jacques Rousseau sense that children are unspoiled and pure expressions of the kind of best elements of our humanity that the civilization ultimately corrupts. This is about that corruption. We've got two figures here. We've got the figure of the child. Children are very important in Blake's poetry and in Blake's thinking, in Blake's politics, and we've got children, particularly exploited children, kind of discussed in this poem. We've got this figure here. Now, in Blake's kind of personal mythology, which he explores in his longer, what are known as his sort of longer prophetic poems, this is Urizen. So probably a play on words for reason. So this kind of decrepit, elderly figure, weak, vulnerable figure represents reason. For Blake, imagination is the sort of most fruitful aspect of ourselves. He is sceptical and cautious of reason for reasons, if you pardon the pun, that will hopefully become clearer shortly as we actually read through the poem. He's being led through a door. There's a note of optimism about this figure being led through the door to perhaps some kind of greater understanding. There's also obviously an image of care and concern for others, which definitely runs through the poem. Down here, we have a figure tending a fire. Fire is a really important image in Blake's poetry. It's kind of cleansing and purifying. There are obviously connections and connotations with hell, but there's also a kind of holy, cleansing, holy light that perhaps London requires this cleansing of itself again, which connects with some of what's actually going on specifically in terms of the language of the poem. As I said, this was published in 1794. The French Revolution has taken place in 1789. That's enormously revolutionary moment, subversive moment, shattering moment, that all of the old certainties about hierarchies, the role of the monarchy and the aristocracy in a particularly hierarchical society comes kind of crashing down in France. There's violence, there's obviously the use of the guillotine. There's a kind of political terror that spreads throughout France at this new possibility. The new possibilities unleashed by the fact that France has now become a republic, a sort of democratic republic. There's optimism, but there's also fears about where this is going to lead. Blake himself was a huge supporter of the French Revolution and wrote about it extensively, demonstrated his support publicly as he wandered the streets of London himself. And, you know, it's a really revolutionary moment, and we've got a really revolutionary poem here. You might not seem as such upon first reading from our vantage point of 2020, but I think this is a poem, as much as any of the others in the anthology, that speaks to our time and where we are as a society in 2020, and still is pertinent in all sorts of different ways, you know, as pertinent as it was in 1794 when it was published. Okay, so this is the illustration. I just wanted to show you this because it's, you know, when you go from this is what the poem, this is how Blake published the poem, and therefore we can sort of think, well, this is how Blake wanted us to engage with the poem. You know, this is how the poem is presented in the anthology. It's not quite the same effect, is it? Okay, but in the interests of practicality and annotation, you know, this is the, you can have a look at this if you just Google Blake's poem, his illustration. If you just Google Blake London illustration, you can see very high resolution versions of this image, but for the purposes of this video and our annotation, we're going to stick with this. So I'm gonna read this poem to you. This is a poem that I think it's important to read aloud. It definitely benefits from being read aloud. The auditory aspects of the poem become really, really key. One other recommendation that I would make is there are some really interesting connections between this poem and the video I made on night walking. Now, the video I made on night walking is primarily focused on Jekyll and Hyde. However, it also explores more broadly the notion of walking around at night, particularly walking around London at night. This is a poem that is, you know, about walking around London at night. There are some real affinities between that video and this annotation, so do go to my YouTube channel and check out the video on night walking. Okay, so William Blake's London. I'm just going to read it through to you, and I want you to listen very carefully and, you know, tune your ear into this wonderfully auditory poem. London by William Blake. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Okay, so that's London by William Blake. Now you'll notice what stands out is the ABAB rhyme scheme, this alternating rhyme scheme, and the generally, not always, generally steady, repeated iambic tetrameter meter, poetic meter, the rhythm of the poem. Okay, now we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. Okay, let's just work through this. So we've got 4 quatrains, we've got 4 stanzas of 4 lines each. It does seem metrically, generally, not always, but metrically steady. It certainly maintains a steady rhyme scheme, which is interesting, which is worth thinking about. Okay, and I want you to sort of keep that in mind as we go through some of these language choices. Okay, now let's start with London. Okay, so obviously the capital city. And it's a you know, the major urban area, urban centre in England, okay, at the time. It's a place of commerce. It's a place of wealth, enormous wealth, but also terrible poverty. Okay, we've got this incredible juxtaposition between hyper wealth and abject poverty in London, and of course the two are inextricably linked because the people who are wealthy are only wealthy because of their exploitation of the poor. Okay, we've got that inequality, and that's an inequality that exists in London and in our society today. That's one of the ways in which this poem still speaks to us. He's wondering, I wonder. Now, normally I would be cautious of seeing the poetic persona, the voice of the poem, the I, as a simple, straightforward expression of the poet. But I think we can probably, to a certain extent, see that as, this is Blake himself doing the wandering. Okay, we know that he did this. We know from his writings and from others' writings about him. There's a great Peter Ackroyd biography of Blake, just called Blake, where these perambulations, this late night walking that he does, is something that Blake finds himself doing regularly. Okay, I wander through each charted street. Right, wander. To wander is to walk or to roam without purpose. If we want to put it another way, you wander around with no destination. There's no specific destination. And this is rather subversive. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, he's not walking around to engage in acts of commerce, to buy and sell things. He's not walking around to transport something from place A to place B. Okay? He's wandering. He's moving through the city. Now, this later in the 19th century, particularly the second half of the 19th century, we get the idea of the wanderer through the city, engaging in night walking, and that becomes a kind of important figure. The night walker wandering through the city either by day or particularly at night, and absorbing the experience of the city. And there's a name in French given to that, which is the Flaner. The Flaner is the kind of gentleman wanderer who wanders through and takes in the sights and the sounds, and we have of the city, and we have that here. Okay, we have Blake being that kind of Flaneur type figure. And it's subversive because he's wandering with no specific purpose. There's nothing neatly rational about it. He's doing it, for the hell of it, for the experience of being in the city. He's not doing it to engage in commerce, to buy and sell. He's simply wandering. And there's a subversive kind of purposelessness about that I think is very important. So I wander through each charted street. Now, what's important here is this word charted, and it's repeated twice. In the original 1792 version of this poem, Blake uses the word dirty. And they would be dirty, they would be disgusting. The streets would be disgusting, the Thames would be disgusting, people dumping all sorts of waste into the Thames, people dumping human waste, animal waste, into the streets. This is before you've got a proper system of management of sewerage at the time. It would be dirty, be disgusting. However, okay, Blake doesn't use that word. He changes it. And he changes it to chartered. Now, the word chartered means lots of different things. If you look it up in a dictionary, it'll simply say it means to map out. Okay? However, the word chartered at the time, and it still retains this meaning today, is to move public land into private hands. Okay? To effectively enclose and privatise what was formerly public and kind of commonly owned, and to shift that into private hands. Okay? Why is that important? Well, Blake sees that as part of a kind of process of exploitation. To take what's commonly owned, in this case like the Thames, and to charter it, to limit it, to place, to leap forward a little bit, to place manacles upon the natural world or what is commonly owned. There's this sense of restriction and exploitation. Okay, that's really, really important. The very, very famous English revolutionary Thomas Paine, okay, who wrote in support of the French Revolution, used that word as well, chartered, okay, to describe the process by which the wealthy aristocracy seize land from common people and take ownership of it. Okay, we can see this being a sort of transfer of wealth and power from the many, to paraphrase a particular political slogan, transfer of wealth from the many to the few. And that's what's going on here. And that's why the word chartered is so important. And a reader at the time would immediately recognise this. So notice that the free-flowing Thames has become chartered. In fact, it was chartered by the East India Company, mapped out, controlled, kind of delimited through this process, and therefore more open to being turned into a kind of commodity. And for Blake, turning something into a commodity to be bought and sold and to be kind of exploited for commerce is revolting, is kind of disgusting to him. Okay, very, very important. So we've got the flowing Thames being restricted and chartered by human activity, which ultimately is going to be leading to its exploitation. So he's wandering through these chartered streets that are being controlled and privatised and limited and mapped out near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face, this word's so important, it's everywhere, it's unavoidable, and mark, that means pay attention, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness. So we've got a little play on words there. Mark is in noting, mark my words, pay attention. Marks of weakness, the kind of physical marks on people's faces. That their faces are inscribed with poverty. Now this is Blake bearing witness to the poverty he's seeing around him. Marks of weakness, marks of woe. And Blake tends to be quite a big fan of alliteration in connecting words. So weakness and woe, the use of alliteration is not just some sort of nice thing that he's doing. It's really important. The weakness and the woe are deeply interconnected. They're one and the same. And they're almost, literally inscribed on the faces of the people that he sees as he walks through London. Okay? And we've got, again, repetition, this strong sense of repetition, hammering it home. Yes, it's sort of regimented, but there's a kind of righteous indignation. There's a sort of, let's get that down. There's a righteous anger here. This poem reminds me of the story of Jesus going into the temple and seeing that people have set up market stalls and are buying and selling and conducting commerce in the temple. And, we often forget that Jesus is a kind of revolutionary figure in the New Testament. He's certainly a revolutionary figure for someone like William Blake. And in the Bible story, in this New Testament story, Jesus goes in and he casts them out, he turns over the tables. This is a kind of angry, revolutionary, dare I say even sort of violent figure of Jesus. And we've got a little bit of that here, that kind of righteous anger at the poverty and the wealth and the exploitation that's going on in London at the time. So we've got in every cry of every man, it's like kind of hammering home the poem through this repetition, this idea that everywhere, in every cry of every man, okay? He's hearing the same thing, and we'll come to this, one of the greatest lines in all of English poetry, okay, coming at the end of this second stanza. We'll come to it in a minute. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, right? Lots of references to sound, okay, band, this kind of like loud clashing noises. We've got crying, we've got these voices. One thing that we've got here is this auditory focus. The sounds of the city. And what are those sounds? They're cries. They're cries of fear. It's noise. It's shouting. Here, ban. Okay? Why does that matter? These are traumatic. These are pained and traumatic sounds. Okay? No bird song going on here. And it connects to these marks of weakness, marks of woe. One thing that's important in this poem is yes, there's people are making sounds. There's got a cry of fear. Men are crying, but notice it's capitalised, so it kind of means humankind. In every voice in every band, the voices don't say anything. They're just these noises, these kind of pained howls of weakness and of woe. And what many people see this poem as, this poem is kind of what can we say, giving voice to the voiceless. These people crying out, and Blake is speaking for them, writing about them, speaking for them. The auditory focus is really important. It also connects with the fact that we learn in this final stanza that this is going on at night. Walking through midnight streets. That it's dark. It's bleak. It's unsettling. Remember, we've not got no electric lighting in London in the 1790s. It doesn't come until well into the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, in fact. So it would be dark, dimly lit only by lamps at night. And again, not every part of London would be lit. So this is why this is such an auditory poem, because the visual sense is diminished. You can't hear, you can't see very much around you walking through London at night, but by God, you can hear the cries of infants, the cries of women, the cries of men, the cries of everyone at night, sort of wailing at what London is and what London has become. And why are they? What do those cries for Blake represent? They represent mind-forged manacles. Now this is a fantastic turn of phrase. Mind-forged manacles is quite clearly a metaphor. And it's one of those turns of phrase in a poem that manages, in a very small number of words, to say something so profound about what it means to be a human being. All poetry is in some way dealing with, what does it mean to be alive? How strange it is to be, alive and be anything at all. And it's exploring this idea of we are responsible for allowing this situation to develop. Now, in the 1792 version of this poem, Blake changes this. I believe the original is something like German-forged chains. And you think, why is he banging on about Germans? Well, at the time, the government employed mercenaries from Germany to come to England, partly because they were concerned that the French were actually going to invade England. So they were employing German mercenaries as a kind of defensive force just in case the French decide to try and invade England. But also because they were so terrified, and I mean by they, I mean the authorities, the rich, the powerful, monarch, the aristocracy in England at the time, so terrified that there's going to be an English version of the French Revolution, that they employ these German mercenaries. So it's kind of like an army for hire. That they need these people just in case if there's going to be a kind of attempt at an English revolution, that they've got these German mercenaries to put that down. So the original 1792 line is German forged chains. But here, so in the original line, the chains are kind of externally imposed. In the original, these German forged chains are externally imposed by the authorities on the populace, on the mass of people. What we've got here is an even more interesting change. And I think it probably speaks to a change in Blake's attitude to the nature of power and the nature of our imaginations. The chains aren't externally imposed. We are forging, creating, manufacturing our own psychological and mental manacles. We are prisoners of our own manacles, of our own imaginations. And that kind of individual imprisonment of our minds and our imagination is leading to this kind of situation. Mind-forged manacles. We are, could we say, constructors of our own Imaginative manacles. And how often do we come across that in our lives? All the time. We can't do that. That's not possible. I can't even imagine that, being different. We struggle to imagine a world different to the world in which we find ourselves. And for Blake, that's a terrible tragedy. That we have created a kind of prison in our own minds that precludes or prevents us from imagining a different sort of world. That prevents us from, to go back to this image, stepping through this door to a new possibility, a new way of organising society. These mind-forged manacles. It's a fantastic phrase. Obviously, the word forge, Blake is kind of hinting at and connecting us with this idea of the Industrial Revolution. He'll talk about factories calling them dark satanic mills, of seeing the Industrial Revolution as a kind of terrible, awful, commodifying, destructive, damaging force in our society. And we've got that going on here, these mind-forged manacles, that kind of industrial language of forging, of crafting something out of steel. Manacles is of itself a deeply subversive word. A reader at the time would read manacles. The notion of manacles was used as a way of showing how ordinary people were kind of shackled, sometimes literally, but also metaphorically and figuratively, shackled by their poverty and by their kind of hierarchical society that the wealthy imposed upon them. The sort of powerlessness and indeed voicelessness that was imposed upon these exploited masses of people. That a reader at the time who's tuned into this would read manacles as a kind of subversive comment on that particular process. And look, we've got here again auditory. What can we hear at night? We're walking through these midnight streets, and then how the chimney sweepers cry. We've got sighing as well. Again, auditory language. How the chimney sweepers cry. Now, chimney sweepers, young children, sent up chimneys to clean them. Really, really important. Obviously, that's an essential job. Incredibly exploited group of young people in society, and I mean very, very young boys generally who were employed doing this. Exploited in all sorts of horrible ways. For example, chimney sweepers were often also simultaneously involved in child sexual exploitation. They were kind of child prostitutes as well as being chimney sweepers. They would often get caught stuck in the chimney and would die in the chimney. They're obviously inhaling horrible substances, so would get awful lung diseases and cancers. Absolutely terrible. And again, for Blake, this romantic with a capital R figure, this exploitation of the young is disgusting, is absolutely repellent, okay? It's an appalling thing. And yet, every blackening church, for Blake, he has a real problem with organised religion, organised Christian religion, the way in which a church can kind of exist. Churches kind of should be appalled by this. How can you have a church in the same city where you've got chimney sweeps? This is kind of disgusting. Blackening the church is turning black. It's literally going to turn black because London is this industrialised city, increasingly industrialised city. So the walls of the churches and the buildings would turn black with soot, but it's also blackening. It's becoming dirty in a kind of moral sense. It's morally sullied by the church almost kind of standing by and allowing chimney sweepers to be crying out and seemingly doing nothing. And look at the soldiers being used to put down revolts and rioting, but they're hapless. Soldiers being sent to die, blood running down palace walls. Think about the presentation of the soldier in the poem of the same name. This is no celebration of kind of military valor. This is haplessness. The soldiers are just hapless. They're kind of pathetic figures, pathetic and exploited. by those in power, sent off to die, and blood running down palace walls. You know, the palace, the wealthy, their palace walls are kind of soaked in blood, and there's an accusation there. There's a sort of there's a moral guilt, and then we've got this final stanza. But most interesting superlative. This is what stands out the most. But most through midnight streets. Now we've got night walking going on. That of itself is subversive. You know, not following the rules. Now, it's not specifically a crime to walk around at night, but there's a connection between wandering around London at night and criminality, and also a sort of rejection of a sense of purposeful walking. You know, he's wandering around at night, is wandering around for the sake of it, not, oh, I need to go here to do my job, or I need to go here to buy or sell something. It's kind of a rejection of that commodification. It's just, I'm going to wander around and I'm going to record the city at night, and I'm going to, you know, convey what the city is like at night and the horrors of it and the reality of London, and I'm going to peel back the layers of what this city is truly like. But most through midnight streets I hear. I mean, look at this. We've got another mention of the word hear. Hear. It's auditory. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse. Now, a harlot is a prostitute. Okay? Again, exploited. You know, we've got, you know, these are women who are going to be having sexually transmitted diseases. These are women who are going to be making themselves extremely vulnerable, victims of horrible violence, obviously unwanted children, all sorts of horrible things. And, you know, Blake focuses on them. And I think there is a connection here with Jesus and the downtrodden. There's a I forget. I think it's in. Is it one of St. Paul's letters? In the New Testament. I can't do the actual translation because it involves a swear word. But let me convey it like this. I think it's one of St. Paul's letters. It uses this idea of Jesus being for the on a whim. Okay, and that's a Hebrew word for the, you know, literally like the dirt of the earth, the lowest of the low. And in many ways, that's who Blake has a kind of affinity for. You know, the downtrodden, the absolute hyper-exploited, the poorest of the poor, the abjectly poor. That's who Blake has a kind of solidarity with. To the harlot, you know, these infants, these poor infants, the chimney sweeper, the downtrodden, the lowest of the low. This is a poem that's trying to, as I've written here, give voice to the voiceless. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse. Again, cursing, swearing, crying out. There's anger, there's rage, there's pain, there's woe. Blasts the newborn infant's tear. Listen to this as a, you know, violence. You know, this violent verb blasts the newborn infants. And again, a reminder of their innocence and their vulnerability. We've got weeping again, tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So we've got blight and plague. We've got the language of disease. Literal disease, people actually dying of horrible diseases, but also moral disease. There's the London and England is morally diseased. And what's that doing? It's destroying marriage, destroying love, destroying companionship and closeness. Okay, connecting it with marriage hearse, this very strange line rhyming with curse, marriage hearse, you know, this connection with death. Okay, now this generally repeated rhyme scheme, this repeated rhyme scheme and generally steady poetic metre creates a kind of sense of regimentation, but also a relentlessness. We've got a seemingly relentless, repeated rhyme scheme. And there's an anger. There's a sort of, as I've said before, a righteous anger implied about that. Okay? So, Blake, writing this poem about the auditory and primarily auditory experience of London at night, of London at midnight. And it's a London full of pain, full of woe, full of anger, full of disease, full of dirt, full of exploitation. And why is that happening? Well, for Blake, it's happening because of mind-forged manacles, those psychological limitations. If we were to think about this today and think about some of the language we might use for the mind-forged manacles, we might think about that as Blake looking at the notion of ideology. How we see the world, the way in which our perception of the world shapes our understanding of what is possible and what the world could be like and what the world should be like. Okay, many people who talk about, so for example, let's think about the coronavirus and what's been going on recently. Okay, many of the things that hitherto seemed absolutely impossible, such as we can go through loads of things. Let's consider the government paying people's wages. Prior to the coronavirus, no way that could happen. Ridiculous idea. Of course that shouldn't happen. The coronavirus, now the government is paying millions of people's wages. Lots of people can do work from home. No, they can't. It's not possible. It's not technically feasible. Coronavirus. Oh, wait. Actually, lots of people can work from home. A 4-day working week. Can't happen. Ridiculous. Waste of time. It's never going to happen. Now there's genuine discussions about people working 4 days a week. Free broadband for everyone. Can't happen. Ridiculous. No way. Totally utopian. Ridiculous. Get it out of your head. Now, actually, the government is going to pay for the poorest people in society, particularly young people who need to access the internet. Just going to give them free internet. So many of the things that hitherto are considered sort of economically or socially or culturally or politically impossible, actually, they're not. Okay, but the reason why we consider them to be impossible is that we have these kind of manacles, these blinkers, these this set of kind of ideological perspectives that prevent us from seeing the world as it both really is and could be in the future. And that's a really pertinent observation and a really powerful observation today. And Blake is making this point in this beautiful poem, this powerful, angry, righteous poem. He's making this point in 1794. And because, if the coronavirus is our kind of revolutionary moment in some ways, making us question the way things are, people saying we can't go back to how things used to be, and we need to build back better. We need to change our attitudes to care work. We need to change our attitudes to the way we treat the poorest in society. People who are care workers are actually really, really important. Yeah, they get paid a pittance. People who work in supermarkets. The phrase shelf stacker prior to coronavirus is used as a kind of low-skilled job for people who aren't very academic. It's dismissive. Horrible term in some ways. Oh, you're just a shelf stacker. Actually, when it comes down to it, we need people to do this job. And it's actually really, really important, because if no one does it, our whole society ceases to function logistically. We can't get food from supermarkets. So these people actually doing a really vital job, because if they don't do it, society grinds to a halt. Okay? So, this sort of shattering event of coronavirus makes us maybe momentarily, maybe we'll put them back on, I don't know, makes us take off our mind-forged manacles. Makes us cast them off. We're no longer in chains. We see society for what it really is, and we also maybe see that we can step through this door to a different kind of society. We might end up putting our mind-forged manacles back on, unfortunately. Maybe that's part of the human condition, that we go back to these mind-forged manacles. But this is Blake exploring the notion of ideology, the way in which we see the world and how that shapes our idea of what is possible. It shapes how we see the world, but also how we see how the world might be in the future. That's what the mind-forged manacles are. That's what ideology is. So this is a fantastic poem, and there are a number of poems in the anthology that this lends itself to. This is a poem about power, so perhaps a really, really neat comparison poem would be something like Ozymandias, for example. An examination of the role of power, what power means, what power does, what power looks like, its impact. But we've also got a poem about place, about London. So the other poems, something like Living Space, which is a poem about place, might also be an interesting point of comparison too. Now, I hope this is quite a thorough video. I hope that this has been useful and detailed. Obviously, by recording these, I'm not expecting you necessarily to sort of digest this in one big chunk, but to go back through the poem, to obviously use my annotations, but to go back through the poem, think really carefully about it, to re-watch parts of the video and so on, rather than sitting and just going through the full thing in one go. But I hope this has been really, really useful. I'm going to move back to, I might do Ozymandias on its own because I love that poem too. Not that I don't love the other war poems, but I felt like London had to have its own video. So I might do Ozymandias next, okay? You should have this permanently. I'm going to upload it to my YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access it from any sorts of devices, and I'll get this stuck on Google Classroom too. Thanks for watching.